announced when Sophie gave a speech in 2019, and she called her to the assembled guests Mama.
Mama, when I have returned from my travels, I have been so proud to share with you the work I have witnessed being carried out under the umbrella of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when someone has just said the unsayable. Not the silence of shock, exactly, more the silence of recognition. Of something that had been building for years finally breaking the surface. Those who have spent time around the British royal family say that silence has a texture all its own. They also say that on the day Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, walked out of one of the most significant private royal meetings in recent memory, that silence followed her all the way down the corridor. To understand why Sophie walked out, you first have to understand what she walked in carrying. When Lady Louise Windsor was born in November 2003, the birth very nearly ended in tragedy. Sophie experienced a placenta abruption during delivery, a serious obstetric emergency in which the placenta separates from the uterine wall prematurely, cutting off oxygen and blood supply to both mother and child. According to medical literature published in journals including The Lancet, placental abruption occurs in roughly 1 in 100 pregnancies and remains one of the leading causes of maternal and perinatal mortality globally. It is terrifying, fast-moving, and frequently leaves no time for anything but emergency intervention. Louise arrived weighing 4 pounds and 9 ounces. Both mother and daughter survived. But the shadow of that night, the intimacy of nearly losing each other before they had properly met, shaped everything Sophie did in the years that followed. She and Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, made a decision that quietly astonished the royal establishment. Louise, by birth and by legal right under letters patent issued in 1917, was entitled to the style and title of Her Royal Highness Princess Louise. Her younger brother James, born in 2007, carried an equal entitlement to His Royal Highness Prince James. Sophie and Edward declined both titles on behalf of their children. Not reluctantly, not under pressure. Deliberately, and with a clarity of purpose that those close to them described as entirely characteristic of how Sophie approaches every decision that matters to her. The children attended ordinary schools. They had friendships formed on the basis of personality rather than proximity to power. When they appeared publicly alongside their parents, they appeared as children first, curious, grounded, unguarded in ways their royal cousins rarely had the luxury of being. Royal biographers and commentators have consistently noted, across multiple decades of coverage, that Sophie managed something genuinely unusual. She raised children inside the monarchy who did not appear to be consumed by it. That is not an accident. It is the result of 20 years of careful, sustained effort. Lady Louise, now in her early 20s, pursued a path that spoke loudly to how that upbringing shaped her. She committed to military service. Specifically, reports from credible outlets including The Times and the Daily Telegraph noted her interest in following the tradition established by Queen Elizabeth II, who served as a driver and mechanic in the Auxiliary Territorial Service during World War II, becoming the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces in a full-time active capacity. Louise's trajectory gestured at something similar in spirit if not in precise form, a young woman choosing service on her own terms, in her own time. James, meanwhile, completed his education at Millfield School in Somerset, a distinguished institution known for producing independent-minded graduates, and, upon turning 18, made his own position quietly but unmistakably clear. He declined to formally claim his royal title. Not in anger. Not as a statement. Simply as a choice, made from a foundation of self-knowledge that his mother had spent 2 decades building beneath his feet. By late 2025, the monarchy was carrying visible weight. The wave of institutional difficulty that had accumulated across several years had not receded. Prince Harry's departure from royal duties and subsequent relocation to the United States, along with his wife Meghan and their children, had removed 2 prominent younger faces from the working family. Prince Andrew remained in a position of total public withdrawal following the civil settlement of the lawsuit brought by Virginia Giuffre, who alleged sexual abuse, allegations Andrew has consistently denied, and the subsequent removal of his royal patronages and military affiliations, confirmed in statements from Buckingham Palace in January 2022. Then, in early 2024, came the dual cancer diagnoses that struck at the working monarchy's most beloved figures. King Charles III publicly confirmed his cancer diagnosis in February 2024 in a statement released by Buckingham Palace. Weeks later, in March 2024, the Princess of Wales, Catherine, confirmed her own cancer diagnosis in a personal video statement viewed by tens of millions of people worldwide. Both the King and the Princess of Wales stepped back substantially from public duties during their respective treatment periods. Catherine's return to limited public engagements through the second half of 2024 was welcomed with enormous public warmth, but the toll those months had taken on the institution's operational capacity was not something that could be papered over. The working royal family, those members who carry out official engagements, attend state functions, represent the crown at home and abroad, had contracted. The public faces available to fill diaries, attend investitures, open hospitals, visit regiments, and represent the monarchy in its ceremonial and charitable dimensions were fewer than they had been in a generation. Against that backdrop, the eyes of certain people inside the palace turned toward Louise and James. Not necessarily with cruelty, but with the particular logic of institutions under pressure. Here are resources that have not yet been deployed. Here are young people who are already royal by blood, already privately formed, already connected to a family that needs them. The calculation felt, to those making it, like simple pragmatism. To Sophie, it felt like something else entirely. Charles summoned Sophie for what was described as a family meeting of significant importance. Those familiar with how such gatherings are structured within the palace described them as something between a formal council and an extended family conversation, operating under a formality that is never quite stated but always present, layered beneath the surface of every exchange. Sophie arrived prepared. She had watched the newspaper coverage shift in the weeks prior with the quiet dread of someone who recognized the pattern. Stories had appeared in several of Britain's leading national titles describing Louise and James in warm, admiring terms. Their maturity, their groundedness, their readiness to step forward for the family. Some of these reports were attributed to sources close to the palace. None were attributed directly. When coverage of royal family members appears in newspapers through unnamed palace-adjacent sources, it rarely emerges organically. Royal press relations operate through a system of informal briefings, strategic placements, and long-cultivated relationships between palace communication staff, or, in some cases, individual members of the royal household and selected journalists. This is not a secret. It is an open feature of how royal image management functions, documented in numerous books on the subject including Robert Lace's Battle of Brothers, 2020, and Valentine Lowe's Courtiers, 2022, which both examine in detail how information flows between the palace and the press. Sophie understood the mechanics. She also understood the goal, to create a public appetite before any private consent had been given. If the British public came to believe that Louise and James were enthusiastically preparing to take on royal duties, then any resistance from Sophie would not read as a mother protecting her children's freedom. It would read as selfishness, as obstruction. She walked into the meeting carrying that knowledge. Charles spoke first, as he invariably does. Those who know him describe a man who, when approaching a difficult conversation, wraps his position in the language of duty with a thoroughness that occasionally obscures where the duty ends and the personal desire begins. He spoke about the gaps in the working family. He spoke about what Louise and James could mean to the institution, the freshness they would bring, the continuity, the hope. He acknowledged that the decision would ultimately rest with the young people themselves, but framed the conversation in a way that made saying no feel less like a choice and more like a failure. Sophie pushed back clearly. She told Charles that Louise was in the middle of an active military commitment she had made with full seriousness of purpose, and that pulling her out of that trajectory to absorb her into official palace duties would not support her daughter. It would erase her. She told him that James had already demonstrated, at 18, precisely the value she had spent his entire childhood attempting to give him, the capacity to look at a title to which he was legally entitled and walk away from it, not out of resentment, but out of genuine self-knowledge. These were not children waiting to be handed a direction. They were adults who had already chosen one. There are moments in family disputes, and make no mistake, however rarefied the setting, this was a family dispute, when someone says the thing that cannot be unsaid. The thing that reveals what the argument was actually about all along. That moment arrived when another voice entered the conversation. Camilla, Queen Consort, had been largely silent in the early stages of the meeting. She had come to the palace through one of the most turbulent entrances in modern royal history. Her relationship with Charles, publicly known during his marriage to Diana, Princess of Wales, had made her for years the most reviled figure in a family not short of candidates for that title. Public polling through the 1990s and early 2000s consistently placed her approval ratings at levels other public figures would consider career-ending. She had endured it. She had stayed. She had, through years of patient, low-profile work, attending engagements, supporting Charles's charitable interests, quietly building public credibility, shifted that perception substantially. By the time of Charles's coronation in May 2023, which was attended by an estimated 2,000 guests at Westminster Abbey and broadcast to a global audience, Camilla appeared as queen at his side and the crowd received her. But there is a difference between public rehabilitation and private standing. And inside the family's private architecture, Camilla had spent 30 years acutely aware of where she sat relative to other people who were more easily and more naturally loved. Sophie occupied one of those positions. Royal watchers and commentators, including those writing for broadsheet publications with long traditions of royal coverage, have consistently noted that Sophie is one of the most genuinely popular members of the extended royal family, not just tolerated or respected, but warmly liked by the public in a way that appears organic rather than constructed. She had never sought that warmth aggressively. She had simply continued being who she was, and the warmth had accumulated. In that meeting, Camilla leaned forward and said something that stripped the diplomatic architecture from the conversation completely. She told Sophie that 20 years of choosing distance from duty did not entitle her to immunity from it when the family needed her. That the loyalty Sophie wore so visibly had always been the easiest kind, performed in the absence of genuine cost. She suggested that Sophie's protectiveness of her children was, at its root, a continuation of the same careful self-positioning that had kept Sophie beloved while others bled. The room went silent. In the silence that followed, several things were true at once. Camilla had articulated a grievance that was recognizably real, even if the manner of expressing it was brutal. Inside the palace, there are members of the family who have sacrificed enormous amounts, privacy, autonomy, the ability to make decisions about their own children's lives, in the service of an institution that rarely acknowledges those costs explicitly. Watching Sophie successfully hold the line, maintaining her children's freedom while remaining inside the family's good graces, could reasonably produce a kind of frustrated resentment in someone who had been unable to do the same. But what Camilla had also done was something else. She had implied that Sophie's protection of her children was a performance. That the mother who had nearly died bringing Louise into the world, who had spent 2 decades building a wall against the same institutional pressures that had destroyed Diana, had been doing so not out of love but out of strategy. That was the wound. Sophie's response came in a voice barely above a whisper, and it was devastating in its precision. She did not raise her voice. She did not become defensive. She said that Diana had once sat in rooms exactly like this one, surrounded by people who dressed their demands in the language of duty, while the institution dismantled her piece by piece until there was nothing coherent left of her. She was not invoking Diana as a rhetorical weapon. She was holding a mirror up. And every person in that room understood exactly what they were looking at. Then Sophie stood up and walked out. The account of what happened in that room reached William, Prince of Wales, through the particular velocity with which information moves inside the palace when something has gone genuinely wrong. Those who know William, who have watched him navigate the dual inheritance of enormous institutional privilege and equally enormous personal loss, describe a man who can move from apparent stillness to absolute decisiveness with very little visible transition. He absorbed what he was told. He did not, by any account, express grief or confusion. He requested a private meeting with his father. What passed between them in that closed room is not fully known, and is unlikely to become so. Palace confidences of that caliber have a way of remaining buried beneath the kind of silence that forms when everyone who knows anything about the conversation understands clearly why it must stay there. What is known is what happened immediately afterward. The pressure on Louise and James was lifted. The decision, whatever form it had been taking, was reversed. Their entitlement to royal titles remained available, as it always had been, to be claimed if and when they personally chose to do so, on their own terms, without institutional pressure applied from above or around them. Accounts from those close to the palace suggest that what William placed in front of his father was evidence, specifically, a documented trail connecting the carefully cultivated press coverage about Louise and James in the preceding weeks directly back to communications originating from within Camilla's household. The significance of that, if accurate, is not simply that the leaks had occurred. It is that Charles would have been confronted with the reality that his wife had been conducting a private strategic campaign inside his own family, manipulating the palace's relationship with the press in order to engineer an outcome, without his knowledge and without the consent of the people most directly affected. A king absorbing that information about the person he trusted above all others is absorbing something that cannot be metabolized quickly or comfortably. Charles's silence, his decision not to push back against William's intervention, not to defend the plan, not to defend Camilla, told its own story. For Camilla, Charles's silence was not a neutral act. It was a verdict. She had given 30 years to this man. 30 years of being the most publicly despised figure in the country, measured relentlessly against the memory of a woman who had been loved in a way that very few public figures in British history have been loved, and coming up short in every comparison. She had done it because she believed, she had to believe, to make it survivable, that when a moment of genuine consequence arrived, he would not fold. That the private solidarity she had built with him through years of endurance would hold. It did not hold. He heard his son speak, looked at what his son had placed in front of him, and stepped back from the field entirely. The word that began forming in Camilla's private understanding of Charles, a word she would never say aloud, that she would never attach to him in any public forum, colored everything that followed. She had concluded he was weak. Not cruel, not malicious, but fundamentally unable to hold a position when the ground shifted. Once that conclusion takes root in the way a person sees someone they have loved, it does not retreat. It spreads into every interaction. It reframes every memory. It renders the future a different shape than the one you had been building toward. The distance that settled between Charles and Camilla in the weeks that followed was visible to those who worked around them. Shared engagements, shared meals, the ordinary textures of a shared life, these diminished. Staff who had spent years calibrating their work around two people's rhythms found themselves recalibrating around one. The atmosphere, by all accounts, was not hostile. It was something colder and in its way more final. It was the atmosphere of two people who have each understood something about the other that cannot now be unknown. William found Sophie at Windsor Castle, away from the formal rooms, away from the cameras, in the kind of quiet corridor that large buildings always contain and that people instinctively seek when they need to exist, briefly, outside the story they have been living inside. He told her what she needed to hear, that Louise and James were safe. That no pressure would come. That if they ever chose to step forward, the door would be open on their own terms, not as a concession, not on a timeline imposed from above, but genuinely and entirely as an expression of their own will. He gave her his word. And then he did something that carried more weight than any institutional arrangement. He pulled her into an embrace. Not ceremonial. Not performed. The genuine physical acknowledgement that one person has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and that they do not have to keep carrying it alone. Sophie, who had held herself completely rigid through the meeting, through Camilla's words, through the Diana comparison, through the long walk out and the long wait for whatever came next, came apart. The thing that breaks us is not usually the thing we are most afraid of. It is the moment someone offers us safety after we have been afraid for a long time. That is when the held breath finally releases. She wept in the corridor at Windsor Castle, pressed against the shoulder of the man who was going to be king. She wept for the hospital room in 2003. She wept for the promise she had made beside a daughter who had barely survived her own arrival into the world. She wept for 20 years of quiet work that someone had attempted, in a single afternoon, to declare worthless. William stayed steady. He let her fall completely apart. That is, in its way, a form of courage too. The British monarchy has survived for centuries by adapting, often slowly, often reluctantly, and frequently only after being forced to confront the distance between its self-image and its reality. The adaptations that have mattered most have rarely come from the institution's formal mechanisms. They have come from individuals inside it who understood something important and were willing to act on that understanding at personal cost. What William did was not simply protect his aunt's children. He drew a line about how the institution would and would not operate, about whether the palace press machine could be used to manufacture consent at the expense of private individuals within the family, and about what happened when someone tried. He drew that line without hesitation, at the moment when the cost of drawing it was highest. What Sophie did, over 20 years and in a single afternoon in equal measure, was demonstrate something the monarchy has always needed and rarely had in sufficient supply: the willingness to say that the institution serves the people inside it, not the other way around. That duty is real, but it cannot be conscripted from people who never chose it. That a child's right to determine the shape of their own life is not a bargaining chip in an institutional negotiation, no matter how desperately the institution believes it needs that chip. Louise and James will make their own choices. They may choose, in time, to step into royal life in some capacity, their own terms, their own timeline. They may not. Either path is legitimate. What matters is that the choice belongs to them, and that the people who love them fought, when it was necessary, to keep it that way. Camilla sits with a new understanding of the man she married, and of her own position within a family architecture that proved, at the moment of testing, to have a different load-bearing structure than she had believed. Charles sits with his son's words, and with the knowledge of what his wife had been doing in his name without his knowledge, and with the awareness that the silence he chose, the silence that ended the plan, was also a silence that said something about him he cannot take back. And Sophie stands at Windsor, in a quiet corridor, held.